John Paintsil, a warrior from Ghana, a defender who dedicated his entire career to fighting under the colors of the Black Stars, a man who turned his tireless runs into a symbol of pride and resilience. From the simple football fields in Ghana to the brightly lit stadiums of the Premier League, from the tough matches at Fulham to the biggest stage of world football, he won over fans with discipline, sacrifice, and an indomitable will. He was not the most famous player. He was not the one who scored the goals that the whole world would mention. But to millions of Ghanaians, John Paintsil is the image of a silent warrior, a man who always ran one more step, fought one more time, and gave everything for the national colors. Millions remember him with that familiar smile, with the Ghana flag on his shoulder, and with a spirit that never gave up. But behind that smile is a story that is not glamorous at all but full of challenges. The years of leaving his homeland to seek opportunities in a strange world. The days of having to prove himself when no one gave him recognition. The pressures of an African player fighting to be respected on the biggest stages. And the personal battles that took place off the field, where no spectators could see. John Paintsil once went through a journey from Ghana to Israel, from anonymous days to the Premier League, where he wore the shirts of West Ham United and Fulham. He once created a memorable journey with Fulham in the UEFA Europa League 2010, once faced the best players in Europe and proved that a defender from Ghana could also stand alongside the big names. But the moments that made him a symbol were not only at the club. They were in the times he wore the Ghana shirt at the World Cup 2006 and the World Cup 2010. When he and the golden generation of the Black Stars carried the dream of an entire nation. But behind the glory of the World Cup, behind the cheers of millions of fans, was a man who still had to face unseen questions. What had he sacrificed to go this far? What had the years away from home taken from him? What traces had the pressures of fame, responsibility, and expectations left in his life? Because John Paintsil's story has never been just a story about football. It is the story of a man who overcame the limits of circumstances, carried the hope of his homeland, and turned life's challenges into strength to become one of the most memorable warriors in Ghanaian football. Before we step into the next chapter, please hit like and leave a heart. It is a small token of respect for a warrior who has spent his entire life running for the national colors, even though behind that smile are battles that no one sees. Please subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying us in exploring the untold journey of John Paintsil. From a Ghanaian boy carrying big dreams to the man who overcame challenges to become a symbol of a nation. Before the big stadiums, before the Premier League, the World Cup, and the bright European nights, John Paintsil was just a boy in Berekum, Ghana. A place where football dreams were not born from wealth or perfect conditions, but formed from dust, deprivation, and the belief that one day those small feet could take him farther than where he was born. Berekum was not a place where children were guaranteed a path to becoming professional players. There, football was joy, an escape, but also a harsh competition among thousands of boys sharing the same dream. Every afternoon, when the Ghana sun was still harsh, the children would head to empty plots of land, where a simple ball could become everything they needed. There were no modern training fields, no famous coaches, no professional support equipment, only calls to each other on the field, feet running on hard ground, and the thirst to prove they deserved to be seen. It was in that environment that John Paintsil learned his first lessons about football and life. He did not learn to win through arrogance. He learned to survive through patience. He was not the boy destined to become a star. He was just one of many Ghanaian children trying to pursue a seemingly distant dream. But what made John different was not just talent. Ghana is a country that produces many excellent players. Every generation has children with speed, technique, and passion for the ball. But among those thousands of talents, only a very few have the chance to step into the world. For a Ghanaian boy to set foot on the big stages in Europe, talent alone is not enough. He needs endurance, sacrifice, and a strong will to overcome barriers that many never see. John Paintsil understood that early on. He knew that every training session, every small match on local fields was an opportunity to get closer to the dream. He was not the type of player who just wanted attention. He did not seek the spotlight, he only focused on getting better every day. Those years built the foundation for the person the world would later see on the field. A defender always ready to run back to support his teammates. A player who accepted the hard work without needing praise. A person who understood that football is not decided only by shining moments, but also by thousands of unseen silent efforts. Perhaps because he grew up in an environment where no one was given opportunities ready-made, John developed a special character. He became humble because he knew there were always more talented people waiting for their chance. He became disciplined because he understood that just one day of giving up could make the dream disappear. And he became strong because from a young age he realized the road ahead would never be easy. The simple fields in Berekum not only taught John how to play ball, they taught him how to fight. They taught him that sometimes the most underestimated people are the ones with the greatest ability to endure. Because before becoming the man carrying the Ghana flag running around the World Cup stadium, before becoming part of the golden generation of the Black Stars, John Paintsil was a boy who had to learn to stand firm amid the limits of circumstances. He learned to fight before he learned to dream. And those lessons from Berekum became the strength that followed him throughout the long journey ahead. But big dreams have never been built on faith alone. At one point, John Paintsil understood that the fields in Berekum, although they had taught him how to fight, could not take him where he wanted to go. Like many other young Ghanaian players, he faced a difficult choice: continue staying in his homeland with limited opportunities, or leave the place that had nurtured him to step into a completely strange world, where no one knew his name, no one cared how much he had tried, and no one guaranteed that the dream would come true. That was the moment many African players had to face, the moment of leaving familiarity to bet on the future. And for John Paintsil, that trip was not just a step forward in his football career. It was the first time he had to face the loneliness of a young man trying to find his place in a much larger world. When he left Ghana to seek opportunities to play professionally, John carried no luggage of fame or guaranteed success. He only had faith, hard work, and the lessons learned from the dusty fields back home. But stepping out of Ghana meant he had to start over from scratch. In his homeland, he was a young player with people who understood him, with family, with friends, and with a familiar environment. But in a new country, he was just a strange name among many other players also fighting for the same opportunity. No more familiar calls on the home field, no more feeling that people knew who he was, no more safety of the place where he grew up. Instead, there were days of having to adapt by himself, overcome homesickness by himself, and prove by himself that he deserved to be there. For a young player from Ghana, playing abroad has never been a simple journey. African football has always produced special talents, but when stepping into the world, they often face doubts that other players do not have to endure. They have to prove that they are not just players with good physical strength, but also have tactical thinking, professionalism, and the ability to adapt to the modern football environment. John Paintsil understood that every training session was a test. Every match was an opportunity for him to change how others perceived him. Just one mistake could make people doubt his ability. Just one not good enough performance could make the opportunity disappear. The years away from Ghana forced John to mature faster. He had to learn to live independently, learn to face pressure, and learn to hold on to faith even when no one stood by to encourage him. There were times when the hardest thing was not facing another player on the field, but fighting the feeling of being too far from home, too far from loved ones, and too far from certainty about the future. But it was those moments that created a stronger John Paintsil. Each difficulty made him mature a little more. Each challenge made him understand that the path to success is not for those who rely only on talent. From the early days away from home, John began to build a quality that would follow him throughout his career: the ability to endure in silence. He was not someone who always sought attention. He did not need everyone to know how many difficulties he had gone through. He just kept working, kept training, and kept moving forward. That is exactly why later, when fans saw him running on the big fields in Europe, they saw a player full of energy, but few knew that the source of that strength was created from the lonely years when he had to fight alone to survive. The trip away from Ghana took many things from John. It took away the peace of a young man living among family and homeland. It forced him to mature before his time and face challenges that not everyone could overcome. But in return, it gave him something more important: resilience. Because before John Paintsil became the defender of the Ghana goal at the World Cup, before he was called by millions, he had once been a young player standing alone in a foreign land, trying to prove that the dream of a Berekum boy also deserved to be seen by the world. The years away from Ghana were not the end of the battle, but only the beginning of another, more difficult battle. When John Paintsil set foot in Israel, he brought no fame, no media attention, and no guarantee of success. He was just a young player from Ghana, one of many African talents trying to seek opportunities outside their homeland. In the eyes of many, he was just a strange name. But it was in those years when no one knew his name that John quietly built the foundation for the career that would later take him to the Premier League and the World Cup. In Israel, John Paintsil wore the shirt of Maccabi Tel Aviv before moving to Hapoel Tel Aviv, where he began to be known more in the professional football environment. But the path to recognition was never easy. He had to learn to adapt to a new culture, a new football style, and a life completely different from what he had known in Ghana. Every day on the training field was a test. Every match was an opportunity for him to prove that he was not just a young player from Africa with big ambitions, but someone with enough ability to compete in a harsh football environment. There is a reality that many African players face when going abroad. They often have to do more to receive the same recognition. Talent is sometimes not enough. They have to prove professionalism, stability, and adaptability. John Paintsil understood that he could not rely on what he had done in Ghana. Matches on the home dirt fields no longer mattered. Praise from those who once knew him could not help him secure a place in the lineup. In Israel, he had to start over from scratch, had to earn the trust of coaches, teammates, and fans through what he showed on the field. And that was when John Paintsil's special qualities began to be seen. He was not the type of player who made spectators stand up with flashy technical moves. He was not someone who always sought to be the center of attention. His value lay in quieter things. It was the speed when rushing back to defend, the ability to chase opponents for the full 90 minutes, the times running up to support the attack and immediately returning when the team was in danger. He was the type of player that any coach always wanted in the lineup, because he was willing to do the hardest jobs without needing much praise. The years in Israel taught John an important lesson. In football, fame can help a player get noticed, but only stability helps him survive. He did not build his career on short moments. He built it with thousands of hours of training, with matches that maybe no one remembered, with patience in times when the road ahead was still very unclear. Behind every time John stepped onto the field was a story that fans did not see. It was the story of a young player who had to live far from family, had to take care of himself, and had to keep faith even when he did not know where the future would take him. There were days he faced doubt. There were moments he had to ask himself if these sacrifices were really worth it. But instead of letting difficulties defeat him, John turned them into motivation. Each challenge made him stronger. Each time being overlooked made him more determined. From Maccabi Tel Aviv to Hapoel Tel Aviv, John Paintsil not only learned how to play ball in a new environment, he learned how to become a true professional. He understood that a player is not defined only by talent, but by how he responds when no one is watching. And it was those anonymous years that created the John Paintsil the world later knew, a defender who always fought, a reliable teammate, and a man who never gave up. Looking back, Israel was not just a chapter in John Paintsil's career. It was the place that turned a young player full of ambition into a true warrior. Before he stepped onto bigger stages, before millions of Ghanaians proudly called his name, John Paintsil had once been someone no one knew. a player who had to find light by himself amid challenging days. And it was from that place without applause that he learned to fight long enough so that one day the whole world would have to listen to his name. After the years of quietly building his name in Israel, John Paintsil finally stood before the door that many players around the world dream of, but only a few can step through. The Premier League. For a player from Ghana, setting foot on English fields was not just a step forward in his career. It was a harsh test, where every weakness could be exposed and every mistake could make the dream disappear. When John joined West Ham United in 2006, he did not arrive as a star already known to the whole world. He arrived as a player who had to continue fighting, continue proving, and continue earning respect from the beginning. The Premier League at that time was a completely different world. It was a league where the pace occurred with an intensity that very few places could match. Powerful strikers, fast wingers, and matches played with non-stop pressure made every minute on the field a battle. For a defender, especially a player from a different football background like Ghana, the challenge was much greater. He not only had to fight the opponent in front, he also had to fight prejudices, doubts, and the question of whether he really had what it took to survive on England's biggest stage. John Paintsil understood that what he had achieved in Ghana or Israel no longer mattered. The Premier League did not care about the past. It only looked at what a player could do today. One wrong tackle could make thousands of spectators lose faith. One bad match could reduce playing opportunities, and for players who were not big names, the path to recognition was always much longer. John had no guarantee of a blockbuster contract. He had no media behind him. He only had himself, his own feet, and the qualities formed from the dusty fields in Berekum. The early days at West Ham were a time when John had to learn to adapt once again. He had to get used to the pace of English football, to higher tactical demands, and to fierce competition in the squad. Every training session was a competition. Every time given the chance to play was a reminder that he had to make the most of it. There was no room for complacency, no time to complain. If he wanted to survive, he had to prove he deserved it. But it was in that high-pressure environment that John Paintsil's characteristic qualities became his greatest strength. He had never been a player who relied on fame. He did not step onto the field thinking he deserved special treatment. He understood that respect in football does not come from words, but from what a player does when the match begins. He ran more, contested more, and always showed a fighting spirit that any coach would want to see. For John, every Premier League match was an opportunity to tell his story. He could not change where he came from. He could not change that he had once been a little-noticed player, but he could change how others perceived him through his attitude on the field. A defender might not score goals, but he could save one. A player might not appear on the scoreboard, but he could make the difference through silent plays. That is why John Paintsil gradually earned trust. Teammates saw someone always ready to fight for the collective. Coaches saw a reliable player. Fans saw a player who never gave up. He did not win affection with big promises, he won it with consistency through every match. Perhaps the hardest thing for John in his journey in England was not facing the world's top players, but having to constantly prove that he belonged there. Because for players like him, success does not come from being given opportunities. Success comes from turning the smallest opportunities into bigger steps. Looking back at the journey from Ghana to the Premier League, it can be seen that John Paintsil never walked an easy path. Every step forward was built with sacrifice. Every success was exchanged for days of silent work. He was not a star born under the lights. He was a player who found the light by himself. And that is exactly what makes John's story special. Because in a league that always honors goal scorers, those who create magical moments, and names appearing on the front pages, John Paintsil represents a different type of player. Someone who fights in the least noticed places. Someone who does the hard jobs without needing praise. Someone who understands that true value does not lie in how many people know his name, but in how much effort he has made so that no one can deny his existence. The Premier League did not wait for John Paintsil. It did not open the door for him ready-made. But with perseverance, discipline, and an indomitable spirit, he stepped through that door by himself. And from a once anonymous player, he began to become a name that Ghanaian fans would never forget. After the years of fighting for recognition in the Premier League, John Paintsil finally stepped into the most important chapter in his club career, when he joined Fulham in 2008. But even when he had set foot on a team in England's top league, his story was still not that of a star welcomed like a hero. John was still the player who had to prove himself every day. Still the defender who did not receive as much attention as goal-scoring strikers or names frequently appearing on the front pages. But it was at Fulham that the world began to see the true value of a player whom many before had only seen as someone doing silent work. Fulham at that time was not the most highly rated team in Europe. They did not possess the most expensive stars. They did not enter every match with the position of a dominator. But under the guidance of coach Roy Hodgson, Fulham became a special collective, a team built on discipline, solidarity, and the belief that they could compete with any opponent if they fought together for a common goal. And in such a collective, John Paintsil found the most suitable environment for his character. Because Fulham did not need a player who only shone in big moments. They needed warriors willing to sacrifice every minute on the field. And that was exactly what John always brought. The UEFA Europa League 2009-2010 season became the most glorious chapter in Fulham's history and also one of the most memorable moments in John Paintsil's career. No one thought an underrated English team could go that far in European competition. But as each match passed, Fulham proved that team spirit could overcome differences in fame. They successively faced stronger, more experienced, and much higher-rated opponents. That journey had nights that Fulham fans would never forget. They defeated Juventus, one of Europe's most traditional clubs. They overcame Wolfsburg, the team that had just won the Bundesliga. They defeated Hamburg to reach the final. Every match was a test of character. Every round was a time Fulham had to prove they were not there by luck. And in that journey, John Paintsil played a role true to his nature. He was not the one who scored the decisive goals. He was not the player the cameras always sought after each match. But he was an important part of Fulham's fighting machine. He was the one protecting the flank, the one willing to face the most dangerous attacking players in Europe, the one who always ran one more time even when his body was tired. That was the type of contribution that often does not appear in statistics: a timely tackle, a run back to clear the ball, a contest that helped the team maintain the game. Those moments might not create million-view videos, but they formed the foundation for a collective success, and that was where John Paintsil showed his value. For a player who had once heard doubts about his ability, standing on the European stage was a special feeling. Perhaps John did not need to prove anything to those who had always supported him because they had always seen his efforts. But for the rest of the world, Europa League 2010 was the moment they began to understand that John Paintsil was not just a Ghanaian defender who ran a lot and played with energy. He was a player who could contribute to great achievements. The final against Atletico Madrid was a moment both proud and painful. Fulham had fought to the end, but ultimately could not lift the cup. That defeat certainly left regret, because they had been so close to a historic title. But sometimes in football, those who fail can still create stories that people remember forever. Fulham did not win the championship, but they made all of Europe respect them. And for John Paintsil, that journey carried even greater meaning. It was an affirmation for all the years he had been underestimated. From a young Ghanaian player who left his homeland to seek opportunities, from a little-known name in Israel, from a defender who had to compete for every minute in the Premier League, he had become part of one of the most beautiful stories in Fulham's history. But what was most precious about John was not the moment he was recognized, but the way he remained himself even when the lights began to shine on him. He was still the hard-working player, still the one who put the collective above the individual, still the warrior who did not need too much praise to prove his value. Because in the end, John Paintsil did not become part of Fulham's history because he was the most famous player. He became part of history because in the most important moments he was always there. And sometimes, the greatest heroes are not the ones standing in the brightest lights. They are the ones quietly keeping that light from ever going out. After the years of proving himself in Europe, John Paintsil stepped into another even greater chapter in his life, wearing the shirt of the Ghana national team. For many players around the world, playing for the national team is an honor. But for a Ghanaian player, the Black Stars shirt carries a much more special meaning. It does not just represent football. It represents millions of people, the pride of a country, the children playing ball on dirt fields just like where John once started. Every time he stepped onto the field in those colors, John was not just playing for himself. He carried the dream of an entire nation. John Paintsil debuted for the Ghana national team during a period when the country's football was beginning to change. Ghana no longer wanted to be remembered only as a team with talent, but lacking opportunities. John's generation, along with names like Michael Essien, Suli Muntari, Asamoah Gyan, and many other teammates, brought the Black Stars into a new era. They were the generation of players who believed Ghana could compete with the strongest teams in the world. But along with that pride was a huge responsibility that not everyone could understand. Because when a player wears the national team shirt, he does not only face pressure from the coach or opponents, he faces pressure from the people watching him back home. Every Ghana match has millions of eyes on it. Every mistake can become the disappointment of an entire nation. And for players like John Paintsil, who was not the type of star always receiving attention, that responsibility was sometimes even heavier. He had to prove he deserved a place in the lineup. He had to fight to protect the faith of those who had placed hope in him. But that was also where John showed his greatest value. He never stepped onto the field thinking he needed to become the central figure. He understood that football is a team sport. There are those who score goals, those who assist, those who are mentioned after the match. But there are also those who do the silent work so the team can move forward. John belonged to that group of players. He was the one willing to run an extra long distance to support his teammates. He was the one who accepted collisions, endured pressure, and performed difficult tasks that sometimes went unrecognized. At the World Cup 2006, John Paintsil became part of a historic moment when Ghana participated in the planet's biggest tournament for the first time in history. For a football-loving country like Ghana, it was not just a tournament. It was the moment proving they could stand on the world's biggest stage. When the Black Stars passed the group stage and advanced to the round of 16, they did not just win matches, they inspired millions that the dream of an African nation could also become reality. 4 years later, at the World Cup 2010 in South Africa, John Paintsil continued to be an important part of the Ghana national team in the most memorable journey in the country's football history. This was the time when the golden generation of the Black Stars reached its peak. They were no longer a team coming to the World Cup just to participate. They came to compete. They came with the belief that they could write history. And John, with his European playing experience, became one of the players bringing stability to the lineup. But behind those proud moments was a weight that only those involved could understand. Behind every World Cup match were months of preparation, the pressure of representing the homeland, the fear that a small mistake could shatter the dream of millions. John did not just play with his feet, he played with responsibility. He understood that the Ghana shirt on his body was not just a uniform. It was a symbol of faith. Perhaps that is why Ghanaian fans loved John Paintsil so much, not because he was the top scorer, not because he always appeared on famous rankings, but because they saw in him the image of themselves, an ordinary person trying to do extraordinary things, a person not given an easy path, but still continuing to move forward. In a generation with many big stars, John Paintsil still had his own position. He was the one who maintained balance, the one who fought in silence, and the one who always put the Ghana colors above personal fame. He understood that greatness in football is not only measured by the number of goals or titles, sometimes it is measured by the number of times a player is willing to sacrifice for the team. And John Paintsil did that throughout the years wearing the Black Stars shirt. He did not just wear the Ghana shirt. He carried the hope of an entire country on his shoulders. 4 years after the historic moment at the World Cup 2006, John Paintsil and Ghana's golden generation stepped into the World Cup 2010 with much greater belief. This time, they were no longer young boys making their first appearance on the world stage. They came to South Africa with experience, with maturity, and with the belief that Ghana could do what no African team had ever done before: go farther than all and write a new history chapter for the entire continent. For John Paintsil, that tournament was not just another World Cup in his career. It was an opportunity for him and his teammates to prove that dreams nurtured on small fields in Ghana could completely stand alongside the biggest football powers in the world. Right from the first matches, the Black Stars felt the weight of expectation. Ghana was not just playing for themselves. They were playing for millions of people watching every run, every contest, and every moment on the field. The World Cup 2010 took place on African soil, and that made Ghana's journey carry an even more special meaning. They did not just represent one nation. They represented the hope of an entire continent, waiting for a moment to prove that African football could make history. In that lineup, John Paintsil was not the one most often mentioned. The lights usually shone on goal scorers, attacking stars, or decisive moments. But John understood his role. He was the one protecting balance for the team. He was the one doing the jobs that sometimes went unseen on the scoreboard. He knew that a big match could be decided by a goal, but could also be preserved by a timely defense, a run back at the right moment, or a sacrifice no one remembered. Ghana's journey at the World Cup 2010 was not easy. They had to face teams with rich traditions and enormous pressure from fans' expectations. But the deeper they went, the more they made the world rethink their strength. Ghana passed the group stage, continued fighting in the knockout rounds, and became the only remaining African team in the tournament. When the flags of other nations gradually disappeared from the stands, the Ghana flag still flew, and at that time, millions across Africa began to believe that the impossible could become reality. For John Paintsil, those moments were certainly one of the most special chapters in his playing life. He had come a very long way from the Berekum boy who once played on simple dirt fields to a player standing at the World Cup, where the whole world watched his every run. Perhaps in those moments, he did not just see the field in front of him. He saw his own journey, saw the years away from home, the days of proving himself, and all the sacrifices that had brought him here. But football can sometimes be the cruelest at the moment when people are closest to touching the dream. The quarter-final against Uruguay became one of the most painful moments in Ghana football history. It was a match where Ghana had fought with everything they had. They were not just playing for a win. They played for the chance to become the first African team to reach the World Cup semifinals. They played for millions who believed history could be written. But then, in the final moments of extra time, that dream stood before the thinnest line. Ghana had the chance to decide their fate. But that moment passed, and the penalty shootout took away the opportunity they had fought the entire match to earn. When the final whistle blew, the pain belonged not only to the players on the field, it belonged to an entire country and an entire continent that had hoped in them. For John Paintsil and his teammates, it was an unforgettable defeat, because sometimes the most painful thing is not losing, but knowing that you were so close to greatness. They were only one step away from history, only one moment away from the dream. But football does not always reward those who tried the hardest. However, time has changed how people view Ghana 2010. They are not remembered as failures. They are remembered as those who made the whole world believe in African football. They proved that a team does not need the greatest resources to create extraordinary things. They only needed faith, team spirit, and people willing to fight for each other. For John Paintsil, the World Cup 2010 was proof of his entire journey. A player once unknown, who once had to leave his homeland to seek opportunities, who once had to prove himself in strange environments, finally stood on the world's biggest stage and carried the pride of all Ghana. The semi-final dream was shattered, But the legacy of that generation remained intact. Because sometimes, those who make history are not the ones who lift the cup, but the ones who make the whole world believe that one day, that cup could belong to them. After the World Cup 2010, the name John Paintsil was no longer just a Ghanaian player playing abroad. He had become one of the most familiar faces of the Black Stars, someone fans looked to for faith and pride. But behind the title of a hero always exists a burden that very few can see. Because when a player becomes a national symbol, he is no longer just playing for himself. Every match becomes a test. Every mistake becomes a bigger story, and every failure does not belong only to him, but is sometimes felt as the pain of an entire country. In Ghana, football has never been just a sport. For millions of people, the national team is where they place their hope, pride, and dreams that daily life cannot provide. When the Black Stars step onto the field, fans do not just see 11 players, they see the image of Ghana before the world. And for players like John Paintsil, the national team shirt is both the greatest honor and the heaviest responsibility. He understood that every time he wore the Ghana shirt, he had to fight more than just a match. He had to fight to protect the faith of those who had placed hope in him. What was difficult for John was that he had never been the type of player who lived off personal spotlight. He was not the one who often appeared on the scoreboard. He was not the player who received all the attention after every victory. His role lay in the less-mentioned things: the contests, the runs back to defend, the moments of sacrifice so teammates could shine. But precisely because of that, his pressure was sometimes more silent. A striker can be forgiven after a goalless match if he once created magical moments, but a defender is often only remembered when he makes a mistake. After many years playing in Europe and becoming part of Ghana's golden generation, John faced a new challenge: maintaining the image of someone always strong. Fans were used to seeing him with a smile on his lips, with a tireless fighting spirit, and with positive energy on the field. But behind that image was still an ordinary person, a player who also had tiring days, moments of self-doubt, and times when he had to overcome pressure by himself. That is what many professional athletes have to face. When the world sees them as heroes, they often have little space to show weakness. They have to appear confident, even when inside they are under pressure. They have to answer the media with calmness after failures. They have to continue training even when their body is tired. And they have to keep smiling in front of fans, because too many people are looking to them for hope. For John Paintsil, the journey of maintaining a peak career was not just a story about physical fitness or skills. It was also a mental battle. The Premier League does not allow a player to live forever on past successes. Every new season starts from zero. Every match requires him to prove he can still compete. Age, injuries, and changes in football are always challenges that any player must face. But what made John beloved was not that he had never encountered difficulties, it was in the way he faced those difficulties. He was not someone who often spoke out to explain or seek sympathy. He chose to answer with actions. On the football field, he let his feet speak for him. In life, he maintained humility and continued moving forward. Many people may only remember John Paintsil through beautiful images: the Ghana flag on his shoulder, the World Cup matches, the European nights with Fulham. But behind those moments are thousands of days of unseen pressure. It is the responsibility of a player representing an entire nation. It is the worry of maintaining a position in a constantly changing football world. It is the silence of a man who understands that sometimes becoming a hero also means enduring more than others. And that is exactly the price of becoming a symbol. Because when the whole world sees a warrior who never falls, very few ask how strong that warrior had to be to keep standing. John Paintsil did not just wear the Ghana shirt on the field. He also carried the expectations, faith, and love of millions of people. And sometimes, that is the greatest burden a hero must bear. Behind the Ghana shirt, behind the runs on the football field and the cheers of thousands of fans, John Paintsil has always been an ordinary person with roles that the public rarely sees. Before being a player, he was a son of Ghana. Before becoming a symbol of football, He was a husband, a father, and a man who had to face the responsibilities of life just like anyone else. The football field could give him the chance to become a hero, but off the field, he also had to face questions, pressures, and challenges that fame brought. Throughout his career journey, family was always an important part behind John Paintsil's success, because for a player to leave his homeland, live in strange countries, and pursue a football dream, he needed more than talent. He needed a spiritual anchor. The years playing away from Ghana, when he had to adapt to a new life in Israel and then England, family was the thread connecting him to where he started. It was the place reminding him that behind the matches, the contracts, and the titles, he was still a person with loved ones waiting for him to return. But the life of a famous player has never been just about glory. When a person becomes a public figure, every aspect of their life can be viewed under others' eyes. A personal decision can become a topic of discussion, a family difficulty can be brought before public opinion, and sometimes, outsiders only see a very small part of the story but make very big judgments. John Paintsil also once went through times when his private life received media attention. Personal controversies once appeared, causing his image to be viewed from many different angles. But behind those newslines was still a man trying to solve his own life's problems, a person who had to learn to mature in circumstances where every mistake could be exaggerated. Because becoming a famous player does not mean a person is immune to difficulties in relationships, family pressures, or emotional challenges. There is one thing that fans sometimes forget. Athletes also have days when they feel weak. They can be strong on the football field, they can face the world's top players, but in life they still have to face worries that cannot be solved with speed or strength. A match can end after 90 minutes, but problems in personal life have no whistle to signal that everything is over. For John Paintsil, those challenges were also part of his growth journey. He went from a young player who only focused on football to a man who had to balance many roles at once. He had to learn to protect his family, protect his career, and protect himself from external pressures. Not every decision was perfect. Not everything in life went as desired. But those difficult periods helped a person understand themselves better and the value of what is truly important. What is memorable about John is not that he never encountered problems. What is memorable is the way he continued to move forward after difficult times. On the football field, he was always the one who ran more, fought more, and accepted doing the less noticed jobs. In life outside, he also had to learn to face challenges without millions of people cheering behind him. Fans often see players through their best moments, a good match, a big victory, a memorable image. But a person's life is not made only from those moments. It is also made from difficult days, difficult decisions, and times when one has to stand up after disappointments. John Paintsil is not a perfect man. He is a person who has gone through great successes, great pressures, and private challenges of his own. But that is exactly what makes his story more relatable. Because behind the player who once played at the World Cup, behind the man who once made all of Ghana proud, is still a person trying to find balance, preserve important relationships, and continue to grow through each chapter of life. And perhaps that is the hardest part in John Paintsil's journey. Not facing the world's top strikers, not playing in front of tens of thousands of spectators, but learning to be strong when the stadium lights are no longer shining on him, when there is only a man facing his own life. There is a moment that every professional player eventually has to face. The moment when the final whistle no longer sounds for him, when daily training sessions are no longer a familiar part of life, and when the eyes of thousands of spectators are no longer on him. For John Paintsil, after many years running on the world's biggest fields, after matches in the Premier League, European nights with Fulham, and proud moments in the Ghana shirt, he also stepped into the most difficult chapter that many players have experienced: life after football. For many years, football was not just John Paintsil's job, it was his identity. From when he was a boy in Berekum, football had been the dream, the goal, and the reason for him to keep moving forward. Every day when he woke up, he knew he had to train, prepare for the next match, and compete to keep his place. The life of a professional player always has a very clear rhythm: training field, match, travel, pressure, and new goals. But then one day, all of that gradually disappears. No more cheers from the stands, no more nervousness before each match, no more moments stepping onto the field with millions of eyes watching. That is a change that many people outside football can hardly understand. When a player retires, they do not just leave a job, they leave a part of the person they have built over many years. A player once known for speed, strength, and fighting ability has to learn to live in a world where those qualities are no longer measured by results on the scoreboard. A person once used to being called by name in the stadium has to face the silence of ordinary life. John Paintsil also had to go through that transition process. After ending his playing career, he had to find a new role, a new purpose beyond wearing the playing shirt. But for someone who had dedicated most of his life to football, finding himself again was not simple. Because for many years, people knew him as a Ghanaian player, a Black Stars defender, a warrior on the field. The biggest question after that was, who would John Paintsil become when he no longer played? But the experiences in his career helped him have the foundation to step into the new chapter. The years competing abroad, the big matches in Europe, and the pressures of representing Ghana taught him patience and adaptability. He understood that life is like football. Not everything always goes according to plan. There are times when one has to change, has to learn, and has to find a way to keep moving forward. Like many former players, John began to look for ways to pass on what he had learned to the next generation. His experience was not only in the matches he participated in, but also in the lessons about professionalism, sacrifice, and fighting spirit. He had once been a young player who left Ghana to seek opportunities. He had once been someone who had to prove himself in a strange environment. And now, he could become the person helping young players understand that the path to success never relies only on talent. But behind that process of finding a new role was still a feeling of loss that very few people saw. Because no matter how prepared a player is, leaving the field always leaves a void. The moments that once made the heart beat fast before each match are now only memories. Teammates who were once close may go their separate ways. Stadiums that were once familiar places now become places to look back on the past. However, John Paintsil's story is not the story of a person who lost the light. It is the story of a person learning to find new light, because the value of a player does not disappear just because he no longer plays. What he has been through, the lessons he has received, and the influence he created still continue to exist. Today, when looking back at John's journey, what is memorable is not only the matches he once played. It is also the way he adapted to major changes in life. From a Ghanaian boy pursuing a football dream to a European player, a hero of the Black Stars, and finally a man who had to find himself again after leaving the field. Because sometimes, the biggest challenge for a player is not fighting in front of tens of thousands of spectators, but fighting the silence after the cheers have stopped. And John Paintsil, just as he once did on the football field, continues to move forward. This time not to win a match, but to seek new meaning for the next chapter of his life. After stepping away from professional football, John Paintsil entered a new battle. A battle with no starting whistle, no fierce contests, and no more moments of thousands of fans calling his name. But for a person who had dedicated his entire life to football, stopping playing did not mean stopping fighting. The only difference was that this time, John's match no longer took place on the field. It took place in the journey of seeking a new role, a new meaning, and a different way to continue contributing to the sport that had changed his life. For many years, John Paintsil had been the one running for the team. He ran to stop opponents, ran to protect teammates, ran to keep Ghanaian pride on his shoulders. But after no longer wearing the playing shirt, he realized that his experience still had value. The years in Ghana, Israel, the Premier League, and the World Cup did not just create a player's career. They created a treasure of lessons that he could pass on to the young people walking the same path he once did. For John, football had never been just technique or tactics. He understood that for a player to succeed, talent is only part of the story. No less important is attitude, discipline, and the ability to overcome difficult times. He himself had once been a young player who left his homeland when young, had to adapt to a new environment, and had to prove himself in places where no one knew his name. Therefore, when looking at young Ghanaian players pursuing a football dream, John saw the image of himself many years ago. He understood the feeling of a talented young player lacking guidance. He understood the pressure of having to choose between pursuing a dream and facing reality. He understood that many young players do not fail because of lack of ability, but because they are not prepared for challenges outside the field. And that is why John wanted to use his experiences to help the next generation have a more solid path. In his new role, John is no longer the one defending the goal or fighting every minute on the field, but his spirit remains unchanged. If before he fought to win a match, now he fights to help other players have the chance to win in life. He moved from someone directly creating results on the field to someone building the foundation for the future. That is not an easy change, because for many players, leaving the stadium lights can make them feel they have lost purpose. They were once used to having clear goals, a fixed schedule, and a feeling of recognition every week. But John Paintsil found a way to turn the past into motivation for the present. He did not try to live forever in the glorious days. He chose to use those days to create new value. What makes John's post-football journey meaningful is that he does not only convey what he knows about football, he conveys lessons about life. He can tell a young player that failure is not the end, because he himself had gone through periods of doubt. He can say that opportunities do not come to everyone at the same time, because he himself had to wait a very long time before the world recognized him. He can say that a career is not built overnight, because he himself took many years to go from a Ghanaian boy to a Premier League player. Those lessons are not in any tactics book. They come from real matches, painful failures, and moments of having to stand up by oneself when no one guaranteed success. That is what John can bring to the young generation. Not only the experience of a player who once played at the highest level, but also the story of a person who once had to fight to find his place in the football world. Looking back, it can be seen that John Paintsil's football life was always linked to service. When he was playing, he served the team with tireless runs. When wearing the Ghana shirt, he served his homeland with pride and responsibility. And after retiring, he continued to serve football by passing on what he had learned. The stadium lights may no longer shine directly on John as before. The cheers may have faded, but that does not mean his journey has ended. Because a great player is not only measured by the years he played, he is also measured by what he leaves behind after the final match ends. John Paintsil was once a warrior on the field, but the next chapter of his life shows something else. Sometimes, the most important battle is not winning for oneself, but helping others have the chance to achieve their dreams. And that is how a player turns his career into a legacy. There is a truth about John Paintsil that many people only realize when looking back at his entire journey. The value of a player is not always measured by the number of goals, big titles, or appearances on the front pages of newspapers. In football, there are those born to be representative faces. There are those who become symbols through decisive moments. But there are also those who build their name through perseverance, through silent work, and through the ability to appear at the right time when the team needs them most. John Paintsil belongs to that group of players. He was not the one always standing under the brightest lights, but he was the one always present in the most important moments. For many years, fans saw John through familiar images: a tireless running Ghanaian defender, a player who always smiled, a person ready to fight for the shirt he wore. But what many did not see was the long road behind that image. Before becoming part of the golden generation of the Black Stars, John had to go through years when no one knew his name. He had once been a young player who left Ghana to seek opportunities, had to adapt to the unfamiliar football environment in Israel, had to prove he had what it took to play in the Premier League. Every step forward in his career did not come from favoritism, but from days of silent work. John Paintsil was not the type of player with a path paved with red carpets. He did not step into European football as a long-awaited superstar. He had to build trust bit by bit. In Israel, he had to prove he was not just a Ghanaian player with potential. In England, he had to prove he could survive in the world's harshest football environment. At West Ham and Fulham, he had to compete for every position, every minute of playing time, and every chance to be on the field. But instead of letting those challenges defeat him, John turned them into motivation to move forward. Perhaps what makes John Paintsil special is not that he once played alongside big players or appeared in prestigious tournaments. What makes him remembered is the way he played football. He played like someone who understood that football does not only belong to the most outstanding individuals. A team cannot succeed only thanks to goal scorers. It needs people willing to do the hard work, people who accept sacrifice for the collective, and people who do not need praise to continue contributing. That is exactly the difference between a star and a warrior. A star is often remembered for moments that change the match. A warrior is remembered for never stopping fighting. John Paintsil was not always the first name mentioned when people talked about Ghana's golden generation, but when the team needed a fighter, when the team needed stability, when matches became the most difficult, he was always a reliable choice. At the World Cup 2006 and the World Cup 2010, John did not just play to defend the goal, he played to defend the pride of an entire nation. In the Fulham shirt, he was not just a defender in the lineup that created the Europa League 29-2010 miracle. He was part of the collective that made all of Europe respect an underrated team. Those contributions may not always be shown in numbers, but they are remembered by those who truly understand football. Besides talent, what made John beloved was also his character. In a football world increasingly focused on fame, image, and popularity, John still maintained the humility of a player who started from simple fields in Ghana. He did not forget where he came from, he did not forget the days he had to fight for recognition, and perhaps those experiences made him always show respect for teammates, for fans, and for the sport that changed his life. Loyalty was also an important part in John Paintsil's story. He was not a player chasing the spotlight at all costs. He always showed commitment to the teams he played for and to the Ghana national colors. For him, football was not just a path to personal success, it was a way to represent those who believed in him, his family, his homeland, and the children who looked at him as inspiration. What the world sometimes does not understand about John Paintsil is that he never tried to become a hero in the usual way. He did not need to be the most mentioned to know he had value. He did not need to stand in the center of the stage to know his efforts mattered. Because in football, there are those who make history with shining moments. But there are also those who make history with persistence lasting many years. John Paintsil is one of those people, a player not remembered only for what he achieved, but also for how he fought to achieve it. A man who went through many different environments, faced doubt and pressure, but still kept the spirit of a warrior. And perhaps that is the greatest thing the world needs to understand about John Paintsil. He is not just a Ghanaian player who once played in Europe. He is proof that sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones always standing under the lights, but the ones quietly keeping that light burning. If looking back at John Paintsil's entire journey, people will realize that his biggest story has never been only in the matches he played or the stadiums he once set foot on. That story began from a boy in Berekum, Ghana, where football was not a path paved with opportunities, but a dream that had to be exchanged for perseverance, sacrifice, and never-fading faith. Before the Premier League playing nights, before standing on the World Cup stage, John was just a boy with a ball in his hands and an ambition bigger than his circumstances. He did not know where the future would take him. He only knew that if he wanted to change his life, he had to keep trying even when no one saw it yet. Those early years built the foundation for the later John Paintsil. Ghanaian football taught him that talent is important, but perseverance is what helps a player survive. There are many Ghanaian children with innate ability, many who also once dreamed of Europe and big stages, but only a few can overcome invisible barriers to go farther. John understood that he could not rely only on talent. He needed discipline, he needed patience, and most importantly, he needed the ability to stand up every time life presented a new challenge. When he left Ghana to seek opportunities abroad, John did not bring fame. He brought the uncertainty of a young player who had to start over from scratch. Israel became the place where he learned to mature in professional football. There, he was not a name people waited for. He had to build his position by himself through every training session, every match, and every moment shown on the field. The years at Maccabi Tel Aviv and Hapoel Tel Aviv not only helped him develop skills, they taught him how to survive in an environment where no one gave him anything for free. Then England appeared as an even bigger challenge. The Premier League is where the world's best players compete for every centimeter on the field. For a Ghanaian player like John, it was not just a battle with opponents. It was also a battle to prove he belonged there. He had to overcome doubt, overcome pressure, and overcome the very limits others placed on him. But instead of seeking recognition through words, John let actions speak. He ran more, he fought more, he did the hard jobs that were not always recognized. At Fulham, the world finally began to see John Paintsil's value. The UEFA Europa League 2009-2010 journey became one of the most memorable chapters in the club's history. In a team not highly rated against stronger opponents, John was part of the collective that created something special. He was not a hero in the traditional way, he did not score the decisive goals, but he was the type of player every team needs. Someone who always appears when it is hardest. Someone willing to sacrifice so the collective can move forward. But perhaps the most meaningful shirt in John's life was still the Ghana shirt, because for him, playing for the Black Stars was never just a personal honor. It was responsibility. It was pride. It was his way of giving back to the homeland that had nurtured his dream. At the World Cup 2006, he and Ghana stepped out to the world for the first time. At the World Cup 2010, he and the Golden Generation stood before the chance to make history for an entire continent. Even though that dream ultimately did not come true, what they left behind was still indelible pride. But John Paintsil's story did not end when the final whistle sounded. Because after football, he had to face another challenge, finding himself again when he was no longer a player competing every week. Like many other athletes, he had to learn to step into a new chapter where his value was no longer measured by minutes on the field or the result of a match. He had to find a way to continue contributing, continue inspiring, and continue having meaning in the football world he had dedicated his entire life to serving. Difficulties in personal life were also part of that journey. Fans often see players through their best moments. They see victories, fame, and smiles. But they do not always see the pressures, responsibilities, and private battles a person has to face. John Paintsil, like anyone else, is not a perfect person. He also had difficult times, challenges to overcome, and lessons to learn through his own experiences. But perhaps what makes John memorable is not that he never encountered failure. What makes him memorable is the way he continues to stand up. In football, there are players remembered for genius moments. There are players remembered for big titles. But there are also players remembered for the way they fought every day. John Paintsil belongs to that last group. He was not always standing under the brightest lights. He was not always the first name mentioned. But when the team needed a fighter, he always appeared. When Ghana needed a player willing to sacrifice, he was there. When teammates needed support, he never turned his back. That is why his value goes far beyond the numbers in his career. John Paintsil's legacy is not only in the number of matches he played, the tournaments he participated in, or the teams he wore the shirt for. His greatest legacy lies in the message his life left behind. That a person does not need to be the most outstanding to become great. A person does not need to always be praised to prove their value. Sometimes, greatness comes from continuing to move forward when no one sees, continuing to contribute when no one mentions the name, and continuing to keep faith when the road ahead is full of difficulties. John Paintsil was once a Ghanaian boy, carrying a big dream. He was once a young player who had to leave his homeland to seek opportunities. He was once a warrior who had to earn respect in Europe. He was once the representative of an entire nation's hope. And finally, he became proof that a person's value is not only measured by what they achieve, but also by what they have sacrificed to achieve it. Because in life, the lights can go out, the applause can disappear, and glorious moments can gradually become memories. But loyalty, perseverance, and a never-give-up spirit will remain. And that is the real story of John Paintsil, a silent warrior who not only carried a ball on his feet, but also carried the faith of an entire generation. Looking back at John Paintsil's journey, what touches people the most is not only what he achieved, but what he had to exchange to have today. Behind the familiar smile of a Ghanaian defender who always fought with all his heart is the story of a man who has gone through many challenges, from the Berekum boy who grew up with a football dream, to a player who had to leave his homeland to seek opportunities in Israel, then fought to survive in the Premier League. John was never given an easy path. He was not a superstar built by media attention. He was a warrior created from perseverance, discipline, and the ability to endure times when no one saw. What is regrettable in modern football is that players like John sometimes do not receive the recognition they deserve. People often remember goals, big titles, or decisive moments, but easily forget those who quietly keep a team standing firm. John Paintsil was not the one who scored the historic goal for Ghana at the World Cup 2010, but he was part of the generation that made all of Africa proud. He was not the only name mentioned in Fulham's Europa League 2010 journey, but he was one of those who fought every minute to turn that dream into reality. His value lies in the sacrifice that statistics do not always record. John's story also carries a lesson very close to American culture. True success does not only come from talent, but from the ability to overcome adversity. Like so many people pursuing their dreams in the United States, John once started from a place with no guarantees. He did not know if he could succeed when leaving Ghana, did not know if Europe would accept him or not, but he still kept moving forward. The lonely years abroad, the pressure to prove himself, and the responsibility when wearing the Black Stars shirt created a stronger person. What is most respectable about John Paintsil is that he never let fame change his nature. Even though he once played in the Premier League, participated in 2 World Cups, and was loved by millions of Ghanaians, he still maintained the image of a humble player who put the collective above the individual. His story reminds us that in life, not everyone standing under the lights is the greatest. Sometimes, the people most worthy of honor are those who quietly do the hard work, endure pressure, and keep moving forward without receiving much praise. John Paintsil's legacy is not only in football, it lies in the message that loyalty, perseverance, and a never-give-up spirit are what last longer than any title. Thank you for accompanying the story of John Paintsil, a silent warrior who carried Ghana's pride and proved that a person's value does not lie in glory, but in what they sacrifice to overcome adversity. Please subscribe to the channel to continue listening to other inspiring stories, and we will see you in the next video with another extraordinary journey.